Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode is another live recording made at the Regent Street Cinema in London just this week. The screening was George Clooney's film Good Night and Good Luck, about McCarthyism, and I'm speaking to the writer and broadcaster Helen Lewis about the film, about McCarthyism, about cancel culture, and about the golden age of journalism. As always with these live film episodes, we are aware that this conversation you're about to hear took place after we had just all watched the film, including our audience. And you may never have seen the film, or you may have seen it a long time ago. So I'm just going to briefly recap what the film is about and what happens. It was made in 2005. It's directed by George Clooney. George Clooney also stars in it, though he doesn't play the main role. The main role, Ed Murrow, is played by the actor David Strathairn. It's worth saying it's in black and white if you haven't seen it. It looks gorgeous on the big screen. Everyone there, I think, was struck by that. One of the reasons it looks gorgeous, and we allude to this in the beginning of the conversation, is everybody is smoking all the time. So smoke curls around everyone in this gorgeously lit film. Among the people who smoke all the time are the main character, Ed Murrow. This is a true life story about a real American journalist. He was, at the time, it's set in the 1950s, the most famous TV journalist in America, and he smoked throughout his live TV broadcast. The film is set in two time frames. It begins and ends. It is framed by a speech that Murrow gave in 1958, in which he lamented the decline of serious TV journalism. But the bulk of the action takes place in 1953, and it is the story of Murrow and his producer, Fred Friendly, played by George Clooney, taking on and taking down Senator Joseph McCarthy and McCarthyism. McCarthy, the junior senator from Wisconsin, had from 1950 to 1953 been running a scare campaign against communist infiltration. In 1950, he was an obscure politician. He catapulted to national prominence, and he became for a while notorious, frightening, but also frighteningly popular, claiming to expose communist infiltration of the State Department, the armed forces, the media, and his tactic was to smear, to throw out allegations, to keep changing the subject, a familiar tactic in politics then as now. And the climate of fear at the time the film begins in 1953 has clearly extended to broadcast journalism. But Murrow decides to take him on. Murrow was already extremely well known in the United States. He had been the CBS reporter from London during the Blitz. The title of the film, Good Night and Good Luck, comes from the phrase that Murrow used to use at the end of his broadcast from London during the Blitz, a phrase that he'd borrowed from Londoners who would say to each other in the evening, good night and good luck, meaning, may not see you tomorrow, hope this one doesn't get you. Murrow brought that into his 1950s broadcast. Murrow was also a hybrid journalist because, as well as doing very serious reporting, he was a celebrity interviewer. And in the film, we see these two things run together in ridiculous ways. He goes from denouncing McCarthy to interviewing Liberace. In his interview with Liberace, he says to him, are you ever going to settle down and marry? And Liberace says, well, I hear that the beautiful young Princess Margaret is looking for a husband. So there is farce along with the serious stuff. And there is a climate of fear surrounding this because they know, Murrow and his team includes people played by actors like Jeff Daniels, Robert Downey Jr., that McCarthy will come after them, will come after Murrow, will come after CBS and accuse them of communist sympathies. Their past will be dredged through for evidence that they are not patriots. Nonetheless, they stick to their guns. It happens in stages. First of all, they do a program about a young man who works for the American Air Force who's lost his job, not because of anything he's done, but because his father was thought to have communist sympathies. And as Murrow says, we don't know if it's true of the father or not, but no son should be convicted for the sins of the father. They make that a cause célèbre, and then they take on McCarthy himself. And they take on McCarthy, and McCarthy comes back at them, and he comes back at Murrow, but he doesn't win. This is a story of the triumph of journalism. They take McCarthy down. The young Air Forceman is reinstated. McCarthy was at the end of this period of reporting, not directly connected to this, but partially connected to this, investigated by the United States Senate, and his bubble burst. McCarthyism came to a dramatic end, or at least the career of Joseph McCarthy came to a dramatic end, and it ended in humiliation, ridicule. This is the story of the part that Ed Murrow played in that. But it is also a story about CBS, as you'll hear in my conversation with Helen Lewis. It's framed in the way it is because Murrow also believes that he was let down by the people who run networks like CBS. There's a character called Mr. Paley, who is the managing director of CBS, and he is constantly on Murrow's case. And in the end, though he allows Murrow to broadcast the programs that take down McCarthy, Murrow loses his program off the back of it. The cowardice, the obsession with the bottom line of the networks is also a background theme of this film. I should add that along with the fictional representations of real people, the film also includes quite extensive use of actual archive footage. So we do see McCarthy in action at his notorious Senate hearings. We do see his sidekick, Roy Cohn. We do get a glimpse of the real president, Dwight Eisenhower, giving a speech about the need to stand up for the truth. So this film is a mix of archive and fictionalized reconstruction. It's about journalists as heroes. It's about courage, political courage, and where it can come from. But it's also about the ways in which corporate America stifles the pursuit of the truth. Here's the conversation. Helen, there's lots to talk about. Politics, TV, the truth. I want to start with the smoking. It looks great, and you feel like one of the reasons that film needed to be made in black and white so that we could see the smoke. As someone who's worked as a journalist for
20 years.
20 years, when you see a newsroom like that full of smoke, what do you think?
Well, I found out afterwards when I read the Britannica article on Murrow that he died of lung cancer. And you're like, yeah, okay, I believe that. But it made me very nostalgic. So I started my journalism career at the Daily Mail back in 2005. And I was a sub-editor. So we would send the first edition, which went at 9:30 p.m. at night. And then there was a break and the second edition went at 11:30 p.m. at night. And do you know what we did between those two things happening? We went to the pub. Yeah, we went to the pub. Yeah, I still remember an era of journalism in which journalism stopped for a bit so you could drink. And those days are gone now.
I feel that the actors in that film, we had the footage of McCarthy himself, you saw journalists, you saw politicians, and they looked...
You think they're too attractive, don't you? You think these people are too attractive to be journalists?
They were too attractive for that lifestyle. So when George Clooney gets in the lift and he says, "You wouldn't believe my hangover," and you look at him and you think, no, I don't believe yours.
You look fine, George.
Your hangover. They look like men with a death wish in the way that they were living, and yet in the film they also look like men who probably were going to live for another 100 years.
I think, though, that it captures something, which is that journalism, particularly before the internet, when it was very deadline-driven, is so exciting because it carries, in the same way that, jumping off like parachuting, base jumping or something, carries with it the risk of terrible, terrible failure. Journalism on deadline has that sense to it too. Like, this could go really wrong. And actually, even if it goes right, lots of people are going to be very angry with us. We are doing something that matters and people will pay attention to. And that is phenomenally exhilarating. It's slightly been removed by the fact that now everyone is on a continuous publication schedule. But I had a big story out last week. It was the Atlantic's cover story. And I did have that. And I remembered it from the Mail that night of, the night before, where you just think, God, I really hope I haven't screwed anything up. Because there's a moment, even now, between sending something to print and it coming out. And that would be the time for the bolt upright, wake up in the bed, like, did I check that quote? Have I spelt this person's name right? And so, sorry that I chose this film after having picked Network. And I realise that I'm going on a binge of picking films where people give a very didactic speech about how to fix journalism, working through some issues myself, clearly.
So we're going to come on to the how to fix journalism. This film was made in 2005. Did you see it when it came out?
Yeah, I did.
So that was the era of George W. Bush, Iraq War, West Wing.
Which I'm just guessing here, I think George Clooney may have seen. So the West Wing, I think, started just under Bill Clinton. It snuck in. But that kind of idealistic thing and big speeches Jeff Daniels turns up in The Newsroom, which is Aaron Sorkin's work on journalism. The unabashed idealism of it, I think, is really extraordinary now. These journalists they're a bit morally complicated. And the other thing that the film doesn't mention is that after getting ousted from CBS, Murrow ends up working essentially for Voice of America, which is propaganda. It might be light side propaganda, but the point of Voice of America, cut by Donald Trump and Elon Musk, was essentially to promote American values abroad. So he has a slightly complicated relationship with the truth, even as someone as heroic as Murrow in this film.
So it's a film about two things. It's a film about McCarthyism, but it's also a film about the death of television, or at least not the death of television, but the death of truth on television. For George Clooney, which one do you think was the one that mattered most?
Well, I think he had journalists in his family. So I think that there is a genuine regret for journalism and a kind of pin to what it used to be. And I think George Clooney is genuinely, obviously me to this in Hollywood terms, is genuinely idealistic. He has made sacrifices in his career that aren't just usual, what I think of as actor bullshit. And they just attach themselves to every kind of slightly fashionable cause. No, his causes have been things like Sudan, like things that no one else has been doing. So I think that bit I take it face value.
Do you think when George Clooney intervened in 2024, and he was not the first person, but in the way he was the person who started the ball rolling, Joe Biden's too old for this job, and if we don't get rid of him now, we're going to take this whole thing down. It didn't turn out well in the sense that they got rid of him, and it didn't.
So if you read the Jake Tapper book about what happened with Biden, I remember thinking as that happened that George Clooney is the only person who comes out of this entire story well. So you have a team round Biden who are all either not seeing the polling or so locked in thinking we're tied to this horse. Joe Biden himself thinking, I deserve this, I fought for this, I get to do it. Also, we think Kamala isn't up to it. And then everything happened until that awful, awful debate where it just became really obvious that he wasn't up to it. And then George Clooney stepped up with a really brutal op-ed in the New York Times that essentially said, I think it said he didn't even recognize me when we met. And it's like, you don't recognize George Clooney? Okay, that's bad. He was in ER. And there was a suspicion that he'd been kind of put up to that by Barack Obama, because the whole problem with that situation was that none of the elected Democrats, this was the hill they were prepared to die on. Very relevant to the theme of this film, right? Which is, you might believe things, but are you willing to immolate your career in order for them to happen? And very few people in that party were prepared to do that. There was a guy, a very junior congressman, who tried to primary him, and all the rest of saying essentially all the things that would turn out to be true. But there was this immense. The only reason anyone could be mentioning this is to kind of knife Joe Biden. This is a right-wing plot, essentially. And Clooney was one of the few who broke through that, I think.
And presumably he thought he was channeling his inner Ed Murrow.
Yeah, and I think actually it was also a very well-written op-ed. I don't agree with that when handsome people can also write. That shouldn't be allowed, as far as I'm concerned. You're too attractive to be this good at prose. But, it was a really decisive intervention. It copped him an awful lot of flack, but I think history has proved if only he'd been listened to a year earlier, there might not be a second Trump term, which I think has been catastrophic for America and the world.
It's also true that debate, the one that you referenced there, sometimes live television has the same kind of edge of the seat, oh my God, what's going to happen next effect, even in our era, that it did back then. And people who watched it, I didn't watch it live, so I only read about it afterwards, but I read about the experience of the people who watched it live. And there were plenty of rooms in America, including of senior journalists and senior politicians, who watched that with the same kind of, oh my God, what are we watching, that you get from this film.
For me, the moment I knew it was really bad was then he gave a press conference when there'd been some set of these rumours, and he got right through to the end of it, and it was like watching someone carrying a Ming vase across a slippery floor. And then right at the end, I can't remember what it was something like he said that Israel had a border with Mexico and they were going to close that, and he obviously meant Egypt. And it was just this moment of like, oh no, this is going to be 3 months or more of white knuckling it every time he does an appearance. The other thing is, yes, it is unfair, right? Because Donald Trump used to get up and say things that were just gibberish, but very enthusiastically. And that like slightly different standard was applied to him. To me, my main takeaway from that Biden era was that even people whose job it was professionally to make judgments, had just glibly assumed that the consensus must be right. They hadn't gone and looked into it themselves. They hadn't watched the footage of him stumbling off stage. They'd assumed it had been maliciously edited by right-wing clippers. And I find that kind of like the willful blindness of it was extraordinary.
Was it partly the thing that Morrow is attacking at the beginning there, or at least he's being questioned about, which is, are you now taking a stand? Because that's not your job. It's not your job to take a stand. So we get the classic argument put against him that you hear all the time, even these days, which is the job of the news, of the reporter, is to present both sides. And one of the things that I think a lot of journalists felt when confronted with the obvious evidence that Joe Biden was not fit to run, and George Clooney was not a reporter, he was an
Mm.
actor and an activist, as you say, was, well, it's not really our job to say that Joe Biden is not fit to run. It's our job to report. It's strange how that argument has persisted from then to now.
Yeah, but the trouble is that they didn't report. So Alex Thompson at Politico did do a series of reports that said things like they've made his schedule run between 10 and 6. They don't put anything in the evenings. He's wearing sneakers instead of dress shoes quite a lot because he has trouble with his balance. So that, if the information was there, and also everybody in the White House press corps would say we don't get a lot of access. He didn't do a sit-down interview with the New York Times, I think, for the entire time he was president. There is this weird thing now where if you talk to White House reporters now, they will say Donald Trump attacks you all the time, but our access has never, like, he's there saying mad things all of the time, right? He will come to the back of Air Force One and just say, who he fancies having shot next, and then how he hates the Pope, and then kind of go back and have a few cocktail olives, which is its own problem. Let's not be wrong about this. But the Biden team locked him down, which in itself should have been a clue. But they did, again, something that you see in this, which is they said, we're not going to expose him to the mean press. You're all jackals. You're trying to bring him down. This is a kind of, right-wing operation against him. And I think if there's any lesson for this film, it's the way that their judgment can be short-circuited by someone being labelled something. As soon as you say someone's a communist, for Joe McCarthy, you didn't need to hear anything more about them, or even they were a relative of a communist. And the same thing happened, as soon as it was like, this is a right-wing plot, a lot of people just switched their eyes and brains off, basically.
And is it do you think it's a comparable climate of fear in the sense that the fear of being labelled, rather than the act of being labelled, but the fear of being labelled is the thing that causes people to hold back? So we'll move off from this example in a moment, but people who might have been tempted to say, for God's sake, look, he's not fit to run for president. The reason they didn't say that, as journalists, commentators, whatever, was because they knew in the climate of American politics now, that puts you in a place where you can be bracketed as one of them.
I think there is some of that. I mean, fear is a bit strong. I'd say probably groupthink or careerism would be better descriptions of it. People who did do it, like I think Ezra Klein at the New York Times was a kind of fairly early person to say this, just got absolutely pelted. And it is one of the persistent problems of political journalism, bipartisan issue, is that it's so dependent on access. It's who's in, like who are your sources, who are you talking to? And actually the other problem is that you have a group of journalists ostensibly from across the political spectrum, but they all spend far more time with each other than they do in their independent respective newsrooms. And there's a status hierarchy, who's been there the longest, whose outlet has the most readers, who's in the favour of the press secretary, whatever it might be, that it ends up becoming such a closed world that mostly answers, people don't want to be a loner in that situation. I mean, the Michael Lewis book, The Big Short, is very good on this, right? The people who call the financial crisis right are weirdos, because they don't, whatever it might be autism, or it might be the fact they washed out, or whatever it is, they are not part of the kind of clique of people who have all convinced each other of the same thing. And there's a persistent problem of journalism, that you want to be part of a club. You're an insider in an insiders club. Do you want to be kicked out of the club?
And yet what we see in this film essentially is a group of journalists who are all thinking the same. They are a club. I mean, they're presented more or less as a club. They're a drinking club. They're a smoking club. There's one woman. She's sent out to buy the newspaper so that they can hear how great they are. It's groupthink writ large. There's no one in the group pushing back. The only pushback they get is from the corporate bigwig, and he's just worried about the bottom line. And yet it's in an America where there's a much bigger version of this going on. So as a small group, in this heroic telling, they are the loners. So it's that weird mixture that it's pure groupthink, this film, and yet it's the groupthink of a bunch of people who believe they are the outsider.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's really how it happened, or if there were people in that team who were a bit like, I'm not sure, should we do this? I've got a mortgage, Ed.
And the only moment we see that Robert Downey Jr. lying in bed, he says, and it's not very convincing, he suddenly says, are we sure we're right?
Should we
And
be on the side of Senator Joe
exactly,
McCarthy?
his wife says, what?
Yeah. The weirdest thing about that, which I never clocked, and I don't know that much about McCarthy, I feel like I've experienced McCarthyism through a range of artistic products and actually never read the original history. How is he the senator from Wisconsin, the
The,
dairy state?
the,
That's very
the
unlikely.
junior
The
senator.
junior senator from Wisconsin. I mean, that is something I want to go and read up on. I mean, one of the nice things about journalism and the reason that the pandemic was so bad for it and that working from home and remote work is bad for journalism is you do actually, in order, if you're going to withstand that level of pressure, you need to have the sense of like we're battening down the hatches and we're a little kind of boat being tossed about in the storm. And any newsroom, this is an insoluble problem. For all that everyone might aspire to objectivity, you actually do have to have a set of common values for everybody that works there, whatever they are. And whether that's just a common value of like we believe that all sides of the opinion should be heard, or we believe in anti-racism or whatever it might be, it's impossible to hold a news organisation together without some commonality. And trying to work out what the limits of that are and what's acceptable and what's unacceptable is a perpetual challenge.
And is that because the pressure is going to come from the corporate bosses? Because the other theme of this film is that the real battle that's going on here is actually between the newsmen and CBS television.
I mean, that is a live issue right now in American journalism. So it's really ironic that this is happening at CBS. I think it's tonight, actually, as we're recording this. It will be Stephen Colbert's last edition of The Late Show. Now, partly expensive show, falling ratings, but also very hard not to see that as a big sop to Donald Trump, who has been heavily criticised by Colbert as a kind of satirist and comedian. CBS News has been essentially like reverse takeovered by the Free Press, which is Barry Weiss's heterodox Substack publication. Now, I think she's a brilliant talent. She is, for example, very pro-Israel. And therefore, there is a feeling that by bringing her in, you're going to change the way that they report some of the CBS's coverage. She's going to introduce a new sensibility. She's going to be more open to right-wing voices. So again, it's about the constant tension between what are you doing for political reasons and what are you doing for editorial reasons? And that's just, that's the same thing. Look at the Washington Post, the way that imploded ongoing, really. The Washington Post, bought by Jeff Bezos, who initially was a very hands-off owner. Then they pulled the Kamala Harris endorsement, which I think had already been written, which was both something that was very pleasing to Donald Trump, who was at that point was still the candidate, but also in a commercial terms, catastrophic for their subscriber base. They were abandoned. I mean, it was the Guardian, America, and the Atlantic's gain, right? Because people picked up a sub instead because they wanted someone that they felt was standing up to Donald Trump. And then he said he wanted the opinion section to be in favor of free markets. Is that a legitimate thing for an owner to do, right? You can have these discussions. In a way, there's this weird belief that media owners should own things that say horrible stuff about them and preach stuff contrary to what they believe, which is, when you think about it, is a weird thing to ask of people. Like, it is what American journalism asks of its proprietors, but it's very alien to human nature.
In the film, McCarthy is given his say on the program. So that argument, the Trump version of the argument, but then it's taken up by people who are not themselves Trumpish, saying the American media is too liberal, we have to hear the voices of the other side. And it never works because it just descends into a free-for-all. But what's interesting about this is it was quite a subtle way of doing it, and it was also slow. It's a weekly show, so my understanding of it from the film is Morrow does his takedown of McCarthy, but takes him down in his own words. And as someone says, who's he going to come on and debate? Is he going to debate himself? Because we've used his own words. He's given his slot, and Morrow says, and I'm assuming this is all based on the transcript, Morrow says, in this program, we are not going to comment. We've given him his chance to speak. He's going to speak, and we are not going to say anything about it. And then next week, we're going to rip the rug out from under him. But we're going to do it not on the basis of a back and forth about the issues, but simply on the basis of the accusations that he leveled last time. And that, to me, seemed like it would be an effective way to do it. And there is no possible version of that that would work in the contemporary media landscape.
That's the bit that's most wish casting to me, is
Yeah.
the idea that you let someone on and they say things out of their own mouth that are so damning that your kind of work is done.
And you can wait a week and then do a live film.
I think, by the way, that's all lies, actually. Yeah, no, that dream is dead of that one, I think, definitely.
And that argument, so whether it's the Barry Weiss version of it or whatever it is, which is there needs to be a rebalancing. So even if you discount everything that Donald Trump says about the horrors of the American media, it is still the case that it slants one way. Not all of it, but a lot of it
I don't
slants
think
one
that's
way.
true anymore.
No?
I think you have to separate out the institutional media, and even then, really, what you're talking about is a constellation of the old television networks, the New York Times, not even the Washington Post anymore. The Wall Street Journal opinion section has always been quite right wing.
National Public Radio.
NPR is basically communist, yeah. So fair play on that one. But how many, like Sinclair, which owns a load of TV stations, the kind of right wing syndicated talk radio has been a thing since the 90s. Fox News, the fact that there are now channels beyond Fox News, like Newsmax and OANN. When the Epstein files were kind of handed out, they brought in a load of right wing influencers, who it turns out now, the Times reported last week, sometimes are being directly paid by politicians. There's this guy called Dom Luca, breaker of narratives, and he charges $100,000 for a tweet that begins breaking, which is a great grift, and I would love to get in on it if any evil billionaires are listening. But, there is a kind of a new class of journalists. The one thing I thought was interesting about this is that if we'd been watching this 10 years ago, the way the conversations about it would have gone would have been about the fact there's no one there who's authoritative like Murrow in the modern media environment, right? That people just take their opinions from. I actually think that's changed again. And now actually we've moved back from an institutional authority model to an individual creator model. That's what so much of Instagram, TikTok, and even the newspapers themselves have caught up with it, right? That it's actually people want to listen to a face and they want an always on podcast. And the instant something happens, they want to hear from Rory Stewart on it or Emily Maitlis on it or, their right-wing equivalents. And we have recreated, but it's tiny now, like it's 1,000 mini Morrows. There's no one voice.
And there is no one of whom I think the line in the film could be said now, which is McCarthy's not going to be able to take him down because there's no one in America who doubts that the man is a patriot. I don't think there's anyone of whom you could say now that there's no one who doubts that that person is a patriot, whatever you mean by patriot.
The other thing that's interesting about it that doesn't seem to appear in this film so much is the sense of performance about a lot of the attacks on the media that you see now. It was interesting that starts with a very sort of chummy dinner, which immediately made me think of the kind of White House Correspondents' Dinner, which Trump was going to attend this year for the first time in a long time. And I've always thought that whole event is a portal into madness, right? You have this guy who spends all his time telling you that you're, lying press and you should be strung up and whatever. And then you're going to give him a dinner and sit next to him and have a prawn cocktail? What are we doing here? But it is so embedded in American journalism that to some extent, every time Trump has a go at a journalist, it's understood to be a kind of bit of performance art, that he has to do that. There is this constant sense that people are just, none of it's real. The unfortunate bit is that it is real when some mad bloke turns up with a, petrol bomb at your house, which is the kind of thing that does happen to journalists these days.
And it also fuels the view that I guess you could put under the broad heading of conspiracy theory, which is it's all performative. It's all a public face. When these powerful, influential, rich guys, they're mainly guys, get together behind the scenes, it's chummy as anything. And that's corrosive too. That's as corrosive as anything. The feeling that they say they want to string each other up, but actually when they're sitting down over a nice dinner, they actually get on fine.
I think it's really weird. I was surprised, actually, after the assassination attempt on Trump at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, how many, even people I'd considered previously quite sane, immediately went to false flag. It's an inside job. It's all a put up. It's like Butler, Pennsylvania. There are people who very strongly believe that was staged in order to win him the presidency. And you kind of think...
And they believe it was staged because it looked so good.
Well, yeah, he came out as well. He did his fight. He looked really heroic. But, someone else died in that. But the fact that the Secret Service snipers took down the shooter so instantly obviously creates that vacuum for that, there will never be a trial for that person. And at the same time, it looks so incredibly inept that, that they let someone get so close to him. Those are all really fertile breeding grounds for conspiracy theory. But now I think that there is just a lot of feeling, even among people who would consider themselves to be mainstream news consumers, that their default response to anything now is suspicion. Well, like you would say that, wouldn't you? Yeah, they're all at it, whatever it might be. And not unreasonably in light of things like the Epstein files, which it turned out that people like Peter Mandelson had just lied, just straight up said, I broke off contact with him, I never did. And then you saw the emails in which that was provably not true. I think all those things are really, this is immediately post-Iraq, incredibly corrosive, weapons of mass destruction as a claim for institutional authority, and all the stuff that happened even in the New York Times around that Valerie Plame case. We have lived through 20 years, really, since this film has gone, where there's just been an enormous loss of trust in institutions.
And yet, there's nothing new under the sun. So we might think the contemporary media landscape is very different from this heroic, very smoky, in the view of this humble reporter world. And yet, it is interesting in the film that the one genuine victim that we see, the newsreader who takes his own life, is driven to that not by McCarthy, but by a Hearst columnist,
Mm.
O'Brien. I don't actually know who O'Brien was, but Murrow says to him, we can't take on McCarthy and Hearst at the same time. And Hearst Media, that whole world of newspaper column writing is directly in a line that leads to talk radio and now Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, I mean, I think the film does a good job of not over attributing that suicide just purely to the witch hunt atmosphere, but also to the
Yeah.
his stage in his life and the breakdown of his marriage and all that kind of stuff. But
But the thing he really minds about is the columnist.
I think the fact that you feel that somebody is fixated on bringing you down is really scary because, in a sense, that is journalism as stalking. And I think it probably has the same effect on people as stalkers do, right? The sense you can't get off the train without looking round. You can't feel safe in your house because there may be someone's outside. And there's a version of that, which is that presumably that guy's life became narrowed down to every time that the column came out. What has he said about me this week?
Yeah.
Will I get fired because of it? And that psychologically is incredibly destructive. I mean, one of the other reasons that I chose this film is that, I felt like during the 2020s kind of racial reckoning and through some of the gender stuff, I did some pieces that were about people who had been quote unquote cancelled, like whatever you want to call it. I think, ostracized is usually a better word. It takes it more seriously what happened. But I wrote this piece about the Guggenheim Museum in New York, from which a very senior white curator had organised a show about John called Basquiat with a younger black curator who'd been brought in from outside, and there'd been some kind of just creative differences, and it had all fallen apart. And the white curator was essentially forced out of her job, even though she was cleared of the racism by a report inside. And the piece ended up being called The Scapegoat, because the feeling was that there's something bad had happened. Everyone was at home because of the pandemic. This was a gallery for like rich white people at a time when everyone was very worried about race. And she just became settled on in this kind of alchemical process as like she was the sort of sin eater for everything that the Guggenheim had ever done wrong. And then when I was interviewing people, it was really hard to get people to talk because they were still incredibly worried about it. There aren't very many top museum jobs in it. But one of the people who talked to me said, I can't really talk to you, but I think about what happened every day and how I was complicit in it and I didn't speak up, right? This person's life was blighted by the fact that they had lived through the ultimate psychological test, which is, would you have stood up against the Nazis? No. Right? Actually, when it comes to it and you're really morally tested, you failed. And that was a huge psychological burden for them to carry. Someone else did speak to me because they'd had a friend who had been cancelled and had killed themselves and said to me, I'm going to take the risk of speaking to you because I saw that happen to someone. This is how serious this stuff is. So it really grinds my gears when you get people saying, oh, everybody who complains about cancellation is just some right-wing grifter who actually gets rich off it. They parlay it into some amazing career. That dynamic has absolutely happened, right? People have done their walk out and into independent creator. But the stories that you don't hear about that never clear the bar, there is just a trail of people's ruined lives through that period from whenever you might want to say 2018 to 2022. That was really unpleasant and to me comparable in feeling to McCarthyism.
It should be said Barry Weiss is one of those people who's done quite well out of being cancelled. I'm not saying she's a right-wing grifter, but...
No, but she left the Times saying it was essentially being edited by Twitter. But I would say that I would be comfortable saying I think she was bullied by her colleagues, on Slack. She was turned into a kind of target. And yeah, again, this is the thing. You would say, did she act perfectly in that situation? No. No one ever does, right? That's the thing, is if you're looking for somebody to defend against one of those onslaughts and you're looking for the perfect victim, they don't exist. People do things that are counterproductive, right? And I think that's a really big part of this dynamic too.
So one question is whether the word McCarthyism is the right word for what's going on now. So some of the characteristics of it, as you've just described, do feel very resonant in 2026 and indeed over the last 5 years, 10 years. The witch hunt, the fear, the sense that one word out of place and you can get ruined by it. the trawling back through someone's history. So again, one of the really striking things in this film, it's set in 1953, and they're talking about, did you go to a meeting in
32,
1932?
yeah.
What are the rumors that circulated around you in 1934? There was a trip you went on in the mid-1930s to the Soviet Union. That feels very contemporary. One feature that's not really part of this film, but was a part of McCarthyism, was the business of naming names. So there's a question about people feeling terrible because they were complicit, because they remained silent. But McCarthyism was one step beyond that.
Mm.
People were dragged before that committee and they were asked to rat out their fellow communists, particularly in Hollywood. Some people did name names and some people didn't. But if you didn't, silence was not a defense. And the people who remained silent, the people who refused to sign the pledges, were the ones who suffered. So I'm not sure if McCarthyism is the word for what's going on now or not. The naming names bit doesn't seem to me to be analogous.
But the thing is, the thing that I think Martin Amis wrote this about Stalinism, the idea was to denounce, and the only thing you could do wrong was not denounce fast enough. There has definitely been some of that recently, like the feeling that why wouldn't you denounce to someone, oh, you must secretly agree with them? That you couldn't make the liberal case for free speech, that you couldn't say, I believe in the right of these people to express this opinion I don't agree with. Actually, that was a sign that you secretly did agree with them. And the idea that if you, said anything in defense of somebody who had been deemed bigoted, that was a stain on you. And I know this from personal experience. I've got, nothing really bad happened to me. But there was a period when, because of some of the writing I did on feminism, I got hoofed out by a load of literary festivals, right? It was something that just took people by surprise, this kind of wave of stuff that was happening. And the thing that was really destructive about it, and I know people who had it far worse, was the sense you didn't know why people weren't returning your phone call, why you'd missed this opportunity, why these people that had previously been quite friendly with you now were icing you out. And those, things that could have been completely innocent, now you always had this nagging thing in the back of your mind of, am I actually, have I been blackballed, essentially? And that climate of fear, I just watched a lot of journalists who I previously respected chose to say nothing during that. And they presented it as like, oh, it's a culture where I don't want to get involved. But they got involved in some other pretty spicy issues. It's just that the side they would have got involved with on this one would have led them into trouble. So, that definitely did feel McCarthyite. Just in terms of a straight rerun, Trump is now rerunning it. People have been fired from the Department of Justice for participating in investigating him very legitimately over January the 6th, over his tax affairs. He's just awarded himself a massive slush fund and perpetual immunity from ever having his tax affairs. And people who stood up against him, he's nuked out of the primary Thomas Massie, just recently in Kentucky, Cassidy, the Louisiana senator who voted to impeach him. The way that he's ruled the Republican Party and kept them in line is by picking off anybody who has crossed him. And it has been very successful at keeping everybody else so frightened or careerist that they don't say anything. And for career officials, he has just purged people who very legitimately carried out actions against him under the previous administration. So when that comes around again, who will put their hand up for Jack Smith's job, prosecuting a president? That is just going to be much harder to do next time that happens.
And that to me feels like one of the reasons why talking about McCarthyism in the 2020s doesn't quite feel right. Because on the one hand, what you've just described with Trump is something more than that. It's the President of the United States. In this film, we got a glimpse of the President of the United States in 1953. It was Eisenhower. And it was the junior senator from Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And in the end, and this was Lyndon Johnson's Senate. If anyone's read the Robert Caro books, Master of the Senate, this is the time when Johnson did not denounce McCarthy, but McCarthy in the end was sidelined. It was a terrible time.
Right. But what if they'd made him president?
But what if they'd made him president? Let's call them they have made him president. So in that sense, it feels something more. And then the media versions of it, in some ways, are something less because they're not being driven by a politician. So there are articles coming out at the moment about the BBC and the climate of fear in the BBC, particularly around gender wars and the questions of trans issues. And reading these descriptions, it is terror. You can recognize it. It is a genuine climate of fear. People were terrified, not just for their careers. It was something more than that. Ostensibly senior and seasoned journalists didn't know what to do in that climate. But no politician was driving that. this was happening inside an organization, and it was happening in many ways from the ground up. And it seems like McCarthyism is somewhere between the two, the original McCarthyism. It's not coming from the president, and it's not coming from inside the media organization. It's coming from the junior senator for Wisconsin. And it was a terrible time. But the other thing about it is it absolutely did end. And we are in a world where I'm not sure either of our two versions of it are going to end.
One of the things that's interesting to me about that film is that they sort of tiptoe around the idea about I guess it comes up at the end. Is it axiomatically bad to be a communist? Right? Can you believe in the principles of Marxism without also believing in Stalinist terrors or being an enemy of the United States? And they're never really prepared to articulate that argument. Like Franklin Geller, the head of CBS, does have a point with that, which is that they always find people to defend who there is no evidence that they are communists, because they know they're looking for the perfect victim, essentially. And if they found someone who had been to a communist meeting once, then suddenly that's too hot.
And they found the perfect victim in the Air Force guy who was fired simply because of who his father was. Absolutely perfect.
Right, but it's equally unjust to fire someone for just having once picked up a copy of The Socialist Worker on the train or something like that.
Or having changed his or her mind.
All right, exactly.
From the 30s. A lot happened between 1932 and 1953. You might change your mind
there was
about your core political beliefs.
Bit of time when the Soviets and the US were fighting a war together on the same side. But there's no kind of allowance for that. Well, hang a minute. You didn't think that the Soviet regime was that bad when you needed them on the Eastern Front. But I think that's part of how power functions, isn't it? It's this idea that instead of having rules and norms that are legible and transparent and everybody can obey or disobey, somebody gets to arbitrarily set and they can change it at any point. You know, that line about give me 6 lines in any man's hand and I'll find something in them in which to hang him. Or that other famous phrase, which I think is a South American, was it for my friends, everything, for my enemies, the law, right? The idea that instead of having universal values, someone gets to be the arbiter. And I think that's the bit where I've been very keen in the last couple of years to defend, kind of unfashionable and cringe as it is, liberalism and free speech, which is the idea that the same rules apply to your worst enemy as your best friend. And that is now a pretty unfashionable opinion. Now, in America, the Trump version is elect me for revenge on all the people that you don't like, essentially.
As you say, there's something timeless about the story in this film. So it's made in 2005 in the George W. Bush years. It's set in the Eisenhower years, but also the McCarthy years. It harks back in some ways. So to me, one of the things it's clearly alluding to is the Dreyfus Affair. So in the Dreyfus Affair, there was notoriously a dossier that was passed around among the judges. And people said, why can't we see what's in the dossier? And the line was, the stuff in the dossier is so bad, you can't be allowed to see it.
And that's tied in with him being Jewish, isn't it? In the Dreyfus Affair.
In the Dreyfus case. But was he or wasn't he a traitor? Had they uncovered a traitor at the heart of the French army? His Jewishness was his main crime. But the claim was there was all of this evidence, but the evidence was so secret that it couldn't be made public because it was so bad. So the proof against him was, we can't show you the evidence against him because it's so bad it can't be put in the public domain. And you got exactly that argument with the manila envelopes. So there's a scene with George Clooney, Fred Friendly, and the two colonels, where they're more or less running the Dreyfus Affair in front of him and saying, have you seen what's in the envelope? And the thought is, the stuff in the envelope proves that the guilt is there because none of us are allowed to look at it. And that's the way in which it feels timeless.
Yeah.
And yet, in other respects, I was watching it and thought, it is weirdly prophetic because there's something about Murrow himself and the way he does journalism. He is a little bit insufferable and he is a little bit pompous, and there's a lot of humble bragging, in the opinion of this humble reporter. And he completely reminded me of Tucker Carlson. Not in content.
It completely reminds me of Alistair Campbell, which is my reference point, right? That people do like that level of moral authority.
So Tucker Carlson, when I used to watch him on Fox News, which I did quite a lot because I found him very interesting.
Oh, he's great entertainer, very entertaining, mad as a box of frogs.
But the style was taken from Murrow. It was that exact thing where he would begin by saying, this reporter has noticed in a newspaper in Detroit this story, and then I'm going to turn this story into a vignette of the ways in which America is screwed. That's what we saw here.
My-
This is the good version of that. And it also felt a bit podcasty, right? The sort of whole vibe, it was sort of
Intimate.
held together with string and tape, and there was Fred Friendly underneath. And it felt pretty precarious. They were working out what TV was as it was going along. It felt like a new medium in the same way that this current environment is. But that style of journalism, that, in the opinion of this reporter, this thing that I read last week actually tells you that the whole world has gone wrong.
Yeah.
This is the good version, but it also leads to Tucker Carlson.
Oh, yeah. There's that bit very early on where they say, do you want to abandon your objectivity and kind of just fully go behind this? And it's a very complex thing, because if you're right, then maybe that is the right thing to do, not just go, Senator McCarthy says all these people are terrible commies, and who are we to judge? But it does also lead you to Tucker Carlson saying, like, delivering consistent narrative, which is, the woke are here, men are under attack, white people are under attack, you can't say anything about Israel. And everything that he does is just takes those as his starting points, and then he will filter any story through that prism. And any story that doesn't fit that prism, he's not interested in. So I would really be interested to get an update from George Clooney about whether or not he thinks that maybe there's something to be said for even-handed journalism after all, or like how he feels about that ambiguity now.
Exactly, because it looked necessary and it looked dangerous. You could say the difference between then and now is there seems to have been at that time, it may be a bit of nostalgia, but a domain in which certain facts were undisputed. It felt a little like it was at least possible with that. We do it this week, he replies, and then we reply. That out there would be a public that would say, yeah, you won that one. Like, your facts were actually better than his facts. He was flaky and you weren't. And that doesn't seem like it's ever going to happen today.
Someone like Joe Rogan has an audience comparable to the biggest TV network, as an independent podcaster. But when he gets something wrong, it doesn't register. He's never held to account for it. It's never like, he will go on.
It's like being the president of the United States.
Exactly. It's very much like being the president. But you know what I mean? So there's this big argument going on at the moment about a very striking report by Nick Kristof in the New York Times about whether or not there is systematic rape of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails. And people have been arguing about this on X all week. And the implicit thing that underlies it, even from the right and even from people who are attacking it, is that the New York Times is held to standards that no one else is. It's volunteered for those standards, in a way that if, no one does that when Joe Rogan says something that has got shaky sourcing, right? There is this really odd dual track now in the media where one group, like it happens all the time with the BBC. The BBC is just held to incredibly much higher standards than GB News, even though they are ostensibly both non-partisan channels that are regulated by Ofcom. That is also quite striking to me.
Thank you very much. Would you like to say a few words about Roy Cohn? Because obviously the film offers footage of him, which I hadn't noticed the first time I saw the film. And of course, his role as mentor to the current president is fundamental.
Yeah, and it's true that when George Clooney made the film, he wouldn't have known that he was featuring a mentor to the President of the United States.
No, that's very true. You will probably know more about Roy Cohn than I do, but to me, he's most familiar from being the kind of baddie in Angels in America, Tony Kushner's play about the AIDS era. Closeted right-wing kind of deal maker, essentially, and kind of Eminence grise, essentially. But yeah, mentored Donald Trump in his New York real estate time. I think now he's dead, I can say this was a colossal wrong-un on a number of fronts, as far as I can tell. It's basically everything that I've read about him is that you're like, oh yeah, no, you are probably the kind of person who would have mentored Donald Trump.
And we're meant to believe that the single lesson that he taught Donald Trump was not just never apologize, never explain, but never, ever, ever back down. As big a hole as you're in, keep digging. The message is keep digging. And if you keep digging and throwing out more and more dirt, you'll get away with it. One of the great things about this film is it shows him and McCarthy not getting away with it. So they didn't apologize, they didn't explain, they didn't back down, and I don't want to call it truth and justice, but something close to truth and justice won. But it's not 1953 anymore.
But also they all got fired. I mean...
Yeah, the journalists got fired, but that's just journalists. They get other jobs, but the Republic survived.
Okay.
I know your heart bleeds for the journalists. I was more thinking about truth and justice.
Is it still possible for journalism to hold power to account?
What do you think? Being non-gender, because I'm obviously going to give you the kind of truth and apple pie version of defending my profession.
It is still possible for, I think, journalism to reveal things that bring the powerful down. And I think it can be done on a issue by issue, story by story, person by person basis. Journalism, I think, is every day exposing things that cause real problems for people in power. Is it skewed somewhat in favor of the people in power in ways that it wasn't in the past? Yes, it is. I mean, it feels to me like it can happen in an episodic way, but much less so in a systematic way.
I mean, I've just been judging the Paul Foot Awards, which are awards for investigative journalism. And you see, there are stories in there, like there is a local paper in Scotland that has been campaigning on behalf of people who have had that really rubbishy type of concrete in their homes. They campaigned on this for ages. There's a piece by someone in The Independent about the guys who do very posh quartz worktops and the fact they've been suffering from this rare lung disease. They had the Mail on Sunday's Mo Farah story about the kid who is actually Mo Farah, whose identity was essentially taken. There is a lot of journalism is happening all the time, constantly. And actually, one of the things that was nice about that is the fact that smaller publications like the Manchester Mill or London Centric, these Substack direct-to-consumer ones, are still doing investigative journalism. I mean, the thing that has probably got better in a sense is that these guys were very dependent on their advertisers, right? The running subplot about Alcoa and their aluminium and the Kent cigarettes that are the best filtered cigarettes of all. Actually, that model has kind of reached its logical end because all of the tech platforms have taken all that advertising money, essentially. So, The Atlantic, which is my main employer, has 1.5 million subscribers who pay a decent chunk of money. That is a revenue stream. What they want is good journalism, right? They're specifically paying for that. And to some extent, The Atlantic is operating like everything else, the lost leader model, in which it does, a whole range of quizzes and TV reviews and op-eds and stuff like that. That means it can also go and spend a significant chunk of money sending Anne Applebaum to Sudan or whatever it might be. So things aren't in as bad shape everywhere as you might think, but the advertising run model in which you have to do things that don't upset advertisers, that's in real trouble because as soon as politicians start throwing their weight around, as Trump is doing in America, the temptation is just to stick to safe, soapy interviews with Liberace about whether or not he's going to get married soon.
Yeah, that was another way in which it felt quite podcasty, both moving from Liberace to denouncing the president, but also the Kent, not quite host read. But, as a,
that was very sponsored read,
I was a little
it?
triggered by not so much that it was cigarettes, but the shtick, which was, you are such intelligent people out there that you're not going to be fooled by advertising, which is why I want to tell you that Kent cigarettes are the best.
Yeah, I'd like to tell you about
I feel
hymns.
like that was my life.
Helen, I was interested by how firmly you put the cancellations and witch hunts of 2018 to 2022 in the past. Do you really think they're over?
I don't think that they're over, but I think there was a social media driven time in which the thing that corporations always did was folded. So whatever, and it went in many different directions. But I think if you look at something like the BBC, it was just caught unawares by a new, much more activist generation of staff who believed in social justice rather than the traditional due impartiality. And I think that to some extent, people have kind of toughened up a bit about the fact that this is a kind of new thing that you'll have to face. It's not just like legal threats from billionaires, but also people will come and hector you on social media from both sides of the political spectrum, and you have to be confident in your journalism, and that's expected. I think in the 2018 period, a lot of places were completely taken on the hop by that. I also think the power of social media is kind of fragmented and faded. Some of those media ones were driven by old pre-Elon Musk Twitter, which now just doesn't exist in the same way. It's now the kind of racist soup that is X. A lot of the original people have decamped to Blue Sky, where they seem to be very happy, but also it's kind of hermetically sealed from anybody else. So I don't think it's entirely over. We're still seeing tribunals trickling through, but I think that the mechanisms for addressing it have become more robust. Lots of organisations have become more robust. And frankly, to some extent, if we're going to talk about gender, it has become a culture war in the sense you have now got a very large apparatus dedicated to finding every injustice or claimed injustice and elevating the profile of that. So we're not in the environment we were. And the pendulum has swung the other way. And actually, really, you're now seeing lots of right-wing cancellations. And that space is very febrile. So I don't think it's a solved problem, but I think it's now a known problem, whereas it was a kind of new pathogen, if you see what I mean, that there was no immune system to, really. It was something no one had seen before in that 2010s period.
And as the kind of journalist you are, writing the kind of journalism you do, can you feel in yourself? So you said you have a big piece coming out and you get that 1953 feeling, I hope I got my facts right. Is that different from maybe 5 years ago where perhaps, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but perhaps the first feeling would have been, oh my God, what's coming for me tomorrow out there?
I think everybody's just kind of wise to it, and everybody has, so many people have been through some version of that from whichever direction it might be, that it's just a kind of cost of doing business now. In the way, actually, libel threats have really diminished since the change to the law, where you have to prove that you have actually been harmed. And that's made the bar, thankfully, harder to clear. The next thing after that, really, that you were lived in fear of was just this kind of massive uprising against you, and then what would happen then? And it's slightly been diminishing returns, I would say, on some of that stuff. I mean, if anybody who now writes on Israel Palestine, whichever side they take, they will expect the other side to do a demolition job on them, and therefore it doesn't seem, it doesn't sort of clutch at the heart in the same way. That is what happens if you write about that subject.
And in a way, that is in keeping with the film. One of Murrow's lines that gives him protection is he knows what's coming. They say, what do you think he's going to say? I know what he's going to say. He's going to come for me. And that actually is the thing that almost gives him the reassurance to go ahead. I know how it's going to go, because they were deep enough in the McCarthy. This is deep into the McCarthy era. They know how it goes. I imagine in 1949, 50, it was completely terrifying.
Yeah, and I imagine that the first people who got taken out by it, unfortunately, I bet their lives never recovered. I bet they never saw any justice.
Yeah.
I bet everybody moved on. And once the kind of fever had broken, people just didn't want to talk about it again. They were embarrassed they'd ever taken part in it. And they just wished fervently the victims to go away. The interesting thing is now, in a way, it's easier to deal with these things because people go, it's just like McCarthyism. Like, he has now provided the signal example that people can point to of what it's like to live in a denunciatory culture over politics.
And I want to say we have to be careful, because it could be better than that, but it could also be worse than that.
I just wanted to ask about, because you spend a lot of time in America, and in a recent piece interviewed some controversial, outspoken people. Do you get a feel for how genuinely held many of the things they say? Because some of the things just sound really nuts, and I do wonder.
Do they really believe that
I do
stuff?
wonder how much influence the whole attention economy plays in that.
Oh, I think you're spot on with that, actually. And I put that in the piece. So the piece I think you're referring to is my Atlantic story about these guys I call the masculinists, who want to, they are upset with feminism. They think the culture has become too feminized. They want to revert to much more traditional gender roles. Some of them don't want women to vote. Some of them want to pay married men more and all this kind of stuff. And I put in the piece that, like when you talk to them, they are charming, nice, very polite. And then you go and look at the stuff that they write on the internet and you're like, whoa, like it's sort of like setting your screen on fire. And that is always kind of a shock. And, partly that's natural. Most of us are not massively confrontational people. We would probably be more happy typing some mean comment to someone on the internet than we would be saying it to their face in the street. But there is also a sense that the attention economy rewards people playing essentially pantomime villains, like the heel turn, like this kind of WWE style version of politics. And Trump is very good at that, at sort of storylining what's happening. Tucker Carlson is very good at doing that, this slightly pantomimey, often quite camp quality, actually, in both Trump and Carlson. I find that it's sort of ridiculous. Like, am I, the edgelordism, am I serious? Am I not serious? About things like anti-Semitism and racism and sexism, in which they are actually pretty serious. But the joke is supposed to be on you for taking it seriously when it comes packaged in this ridiculous outer layer. And I don't think anyone's really worked out how to deal with that yet.
And it was one of the ways they got McCarthy. He took himself completely seriously.
I wish people would go back to taking themselves. Like, very pompous people are easy to puncture. But like, all politicians now want to be in on the joke, essentially, which is really annoying from somebody who wants to make jokes about them. Like, stop
All
it.
politicians except Keir Starmer.
He did a bit of light banter at PMQs today about how he'd accidentally signed a trade deal with North Korea. That had them rolling in the aisles. But yes, no, I feel like our next Prime Minister can only be an upgrade in the banter stakes.
Next time, it's the first episode in a new set of episodes about the great political fictions. I'm going to be talking about a set of novels from the last 100 years. that in different ways, I think, are illuminating, revelatory about how our world works. And I'm going to be starting with one of the most celebrated, one of the most notorious dystopian visions from nearly 100 years ago of what the future, our future, might be like, and asking if any of it has come true. I'm talking about Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.